So next, what we're going to be looking at is our journal entry testing system, which is called J.E.T.S, right? And this feature is essentially a risk-weighted testing system of different tests and analytics that we can run over the entire population that we have, and it will then give us results on whether those items have failed those tests, and at the end of the day sum up every single one of those risks that have failed from the test, and then give us a total risk per transaction. Now, this is mostly useful when you're doing your journal entry testing, and even though it is called the journal entry testing system, it is essentially more to kind of help you and identify the journals that might need some extra work, or items like that. So we're going to go ahead and start that now. So to get started, first thing we need to do is head over to the Audit Toolbar into J.E.T.S, right? And when we click on this, we'll see the journal entry testing system over here. So you can see at the top, we've got our range selector, which is common practice in a lot of the Audit Toolbar's functions. So you should be comfortable with that already. Then we've got the date format, the selector, where we just need to select the default date format that we have in our GL. And we can see my date format starts with days, then months, then the year. So that's exactly the same as what we have here, with the same delimiter as well. So no need to change that. Now, the next thing we then need to go and start to have a look at is the actual tabs that we have here. So we start off with the intro tab, and essentially what this is just giving us a summary of what we're about to do, okay, and what we're about to jump into. So it's telling us that J.E.T.S creates a risk-weighted report on multiple journal tests and ranks higher risk transactions in a single procedure, right? And on the next tabs, we're going to identify those tests that we'd like to run and the risk that's going to be allocated to each item. And the risk weighting is from 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. And once we're done, we can see everything in the summary tab. So let's get into it. We'll start off with the amount related tab. So when we go into that, you can see that my test at the moment has some items already in it. And the reason for this is because J.E.T.S saves your inputs, right, between users. So if you use specific items and you run specific tests always, then you'll always see those tests come up whenever you're running your J.E.T.S function. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, hence why you see mine are already selected. Okay, now the first thing to note here is that we have the amount heading that we need to consider. So the amount heading is going to determine where these tests are going to be performed. So that's the most important thing. And you'll see that across all of the different tests. Now, in some instances, you might not have certain headings, certain information in your GL, like maybe a time column or something like that. And in that case, you can simply skip that item. But generally, if you do ask your client for a specific journal entry report, then it should have all the information in it. Okay, so first off, we start with the amount heading. We've got that in, it's correct. The Audit Toolbar will always try to identify these headings automatically, but sometimes it might select a different amount heading that's incorrectly selected. So we can then go ahead into the drop down and select the correct heading if that's necessary. Okay, so let's then look at our tests. We've got 3 tests that we can perform here. Statistical outliers, which means that the Audit Toolbar will perform a statistical calculation internally to determine what is the average range that transactions are generally being processed within, and then anything outside of that range would then be picked up as a statistical outlier. Okay, now in this case, my risk score, I can either always give it a 1, for every single one of my transactions, and in that way, what I would see at the end of the day is the total risk being the number of tests that an item has failed. Or I can apply my score, my risk weighting to my specific client, which would mean that I would need to make it applicable to what their risk is, what we've seen in prior years, and what we choose to have from our assessment. Okay, but for now, I'm going to just go ahead and select, let's go with 4, because values are always quite important. Then the next item we have are our material items. And over here, we can see we can then select a value for materiality and anything that is on an absolute basis. So it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, anything that's above 30,000 or negative 30,000, below negative 30,000 would then be considered a material item. Okay, so there will be crossover between material items and statistical outliers in most instances. So again, in this case, I'm going to give my material items a risk weighting of 5. Then we have rounded amount. And this is essentially looking for any items that are rounded to the level that we are setting, right? And then it will then give us every single one of those transactions. Now, the rounding levels, we can select them from here. And if I select 1,000, that means that it will only give me items that are perfectly divided by, that can be perfectly divided by 1,000. So something like 300,000 can be divided by 1,000 because that would be 300, and therefore that would be an item that would be picked up. Something like 2,000 can also be divided by 1,000. The answer would be 2, so that would also be picked up. Okay. And again, here, I'm going to give it a risk of 4. Now, let's move on to our date and time related items. So here you can see I've got a time heading, right? So this is required for the working hours test over here. Then we've got our posting date, which is generally the date that transactions take place in our GL, right? And that is necessary for non-working days, public holidays, those kinds of things, as well as for the other sides of our tests that we have on this side as well. But I'll come over to that now in a second. Then we've got our transaction date, and the transaction date is like the document date, the effective date of the actual transaction. Okay, so this test is essential. This heading is essential for our backdated and forward posted tests here, because we need to be able to compare the posting date to the transaction date in order to get an answer and see if those items failed or not. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a look at our test. So the first one we've got is non-working days. So I'm going to go ahead and untick this and then tick it again, and you'll see that it's asking me to select weekdays. So I get to select on which days our clients, accountants, or their systems, or they aren't working on the days that we aren't expecting transactions to be processed. We're going to select those items. Now, generally that would be Saturday and Sunday, but with the change of things since COVID, you never know. So we've allowed you to be able to select whichever you want. But for now, I'm going to keep it the same as Saturday and Sunday. Okay. Then I'm going to give this a score. Now, like I said, this might not be as important as it was before COVID, with everybody working from home and things, but I'm going to give it a score of 2 in this case, just in the general sense. Then we have our public holidays, right? And currently we have a few public holidays here in the Audit Toolbar, but if you do notice that, hey, there's a public holiday that you would like to have, like a country's public holiday that you'd like to have in here, please do let us know. We'll be more than happy to add that in. Okay. But for now, we've got the UK. I'm going to use that as well. And again, I'm going to give this a 2 as a my risk weighting. Then I've got working hours, where I can enter the actual working hours that we are expecting our client to be working. And so anything outside of that would be higher risk. But I want to give them a little bit of leeway, right? So we know they work from 8 to 5, but I'm going to give them a little bit of leeway, make it 8:30 to 5:30, just for that little bit of time that happens after work hours sometimes when you need to finish something off. Completely up to you how you end up doing this. Okay, so I'm also going to give this a risk of 2 because of the exact same reason that I mentioned before. Then we've got closing entries. Now, our closing entries is going to look at the transactions that are processed at the end of the period. And so in the last month of the transactions that we have available, and it's going to look at the last X amount of days in that last month. Okay. Now, if your data set has more than 12 months in it, in other words, you have the post year end transactions in there as well, it is only going to run for the first 12 months. And then everything from the closing amount of days that you've selected plus the 13th month would then be considered a closing entry. Okay, so I'm going to say, everything in the last 5 days is going to be considered my closing entries. Okay, and I'm going to give this a score of 3, good and neutral. Then we've got backdated and forward posted. So this means that if something's backdated, that means that it is a transaction that should be taking place now, right? But we posted it backwards. So we moved it back into a different period than what it was meant to be in. And forward posted is literally the opposite. It was posted forward into a period that it was not meant to be in yet, but the transaction happened maybe in the previous financial year or something. Okay, so that's what we're going to add here. And again, I'm just going to keep these neutral as well. Perfect. Then we move on to the next item, which is our description related items. Okay, so here you can see we've got blank descriptions, and this is going to look at specifically the description column, right? And find anything that does not have a description. Now you can change your description column if you'd like to, if there's other descriptions that you'd like to use or a different column that you'd like to use. But for now, we're going to keep it as the description column. I'm going to give this a score of 1 because it's not really that, like, it might just be a mistake, probably not that big an issue. We'll see, depends on what's happening with the client. Okay. Then we've got keywords. And now keywords is very important because whatever keywords we enter below, right, the audit toolbar will then go and find any transaction that has that keyword in it and pull that out as a failure on this test, if that makes sense, right? So that means we could use this to identify our related party transactions by giving the abbreviations of the related parties, by giving all the different names of related parties that we have available to us to help us identify these related parties transactions. We can do this for any fraud risk words or anything like that we want to pick up. Okay, so for this, I'm going to go and give this a score of 4 in this case. Perfect. Then we move over to our account and user related items. Now, firstly, we can see our account heading has been selected correctly, right? But our user heading hasn't. We'll come back to that in a second. Now, for the account heading, it's very important to consider, am I running this on just my journals or am I running this on the full population? Because if you're running this on just the journal entries, something that is a zero balance account in just your journal entries would mean that it is a zero balance only from the journals and not from the total in the rest of the GL. So do keep that in mind, okay? And then seldom used accounts just looks at if there is less than 12 transactions for that account in the year, and if on average all accounts have less than 12 transactions in it, then it calculates a average and determines what is below that average. Okay, so in these cases, I'm going to go ahead and give this a good neutral score of 3 as well, right? And then we can move on to our user related items. So in the user related items, the first thing we need to do is select our user heading. Because this is quite difficult for the audit toolbar to identify, because it's always weird that it comes up. It does try to identify it, but it cannot just always get it 100% correct. So we're going to go in here, and our posted by is the user. That's the person who's posted this transaction. And you see, when I select this, these two tests now become available for us to use and select. So the first one we've got is irregular users, which is going to look at the average number of transactions being posted by each user, and anyone who's below a statistical threshold would then be considered a irregular user. Okay, again, this might not be a big issue in our client, so I'm going to give it a 2. Then we've got high risk users. So this is specific individuals that we know that their transactions carry weight, and we want to consider them as a higher risk compared to everybody else, right? So we can go in here and we can say, okay, Frank, I know Frank's been doing some dodgy stuff or whatever the case might be. So we're going to say Frank is a high risk user. We can select multiple, but in this case, I just want to select Frank. Okay, so let's go ahead and give this a score. Because this is a high risk user, I'm going to give this a score of 4. Okay, now that I've put in all of my tests, I can head over to the summary tab over here, and this will show me a quick rundown of everything that we've populated. So this is just an easy way for you to check and double check that you've populated everything correctly, because obviously there's a lot to consider. So we can just double check here, and the great thing about this is everything here cannot be changed. This is completely unchangeable. So what you're seeing here is just an overview. Okay, now that we're done with that, we are pretty much ready to go ahead and start the test. But I want to show three options here at the bottom, right? So we've got reset clear, and what this does is when you start off this function for the first time, right? Like I mentioned before, it saves the details that you populated from the first run. And if you want to reset it completely, you can click on reset clear and it will reset everything to the default state. Okay. Then we've got default scoring. And this means that it's going to apply default scoring, the score that you select, to all the tests that you are running. So you can do this if you want to just apply the same score to everything and just run your test, okay? And lastly, we've got generate charts. Now, I would suggest to always run with generate charts, because generate charts is going to give us the additional information that comes along with the analytics that are being performed. Okay, so with all of that information, we're then going to go ahead and click on continue and run this function. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to click on continue here, and you'll see that the audit toolbar is going to then start running, and generally at 45% is where it stops for a second to start thinking, and then it will pick up again, as you see there, and there we go, we get our results. Now, from that one sheet that we had, we now got 3 new sheets into our document. Okay, so this first sheet is the results of the test. So it's showing us each and every single test that has been performed up here, the value of the risk that is being assigned if a transaction has failed that test. So we can see material items. It added a 5 here because that is the risk weighting that we gave it, right? Because this transaction is above our materiality of 30,000 that we used, right? So that's what's happening all throughout all of this over here. And ultimately, we're getting our total risk at the end. And this is just a heat map to show us how our risks are distributed. So from the darkest red, it's just going to the lightest green all the way, which is the lowest risk that we have over here. Now, currently, this runs on a line-by-line basis, so it doesn't take into consideration yet the individual journal, like the actual journals together. It considers them as individual line items. In future, we will have a function that will combine this together so that you can either choose to run it on individual line items or choose to run it on each journal individually. Okay, so yeah, now that we see this is what we're going to use to determine what we want to select for testing. So we can say, okay, we want to test everything that is above the risk score of 18. So we would then have up to here 19 transactions that we would want to test. Okay, And the great thing about this is, along with knowing what transactions you want to test, you also have an idea as to why you're testing them, because you want to find out if the accuracy of this item is valid, because over here we can see that it is material, it is a statistical outlier, it is also a rounded amount, which is a fraud indicator. So we also want to make sure that the value and the transaction is valid. Then we can see it was processed on a non-working day, so that's also another fraud indicator, that we might want to look into a little bit further. Then we also get here, oh, this was forward posted. And so that's another item we want to find out what happened on. So these tests also give you a very good idea as to what you want to get from your client in terms of support on each transaction. Then when we head over into the summary tab, right? So this summary tab and the J.E.T.S parameters tab, those two are the two that get added with the tick box that says generate sheets. Okay, generate charts. Sorry. So here we're seeing a summary, firstly, of each of the total risks, right? So the total number of transactions that have a total risk of 16 is 2. And the total number that has a risk of 14 is 2, and so on and so forth. And generally, the distribution that you would like to see is going from high at the lower end down to low at the higher end, right? And if that isn't the case, then you always have the option and ability to take this as the basis of adjusting your tests and your risk scores from the previous test in order to rerun it, because you might identify that one of the tests is a little bit too high or something like that. Now, along with this, what helps with that assessment is the below, which is giving us an idea as to how many transactions have failed each test. So we can see over here we've got quite a lot of transactions failing each of the tests, but not a lot of transactions failing each of the tests, but a lot that are failing this keywords test, right? And that's because we put quite a few keywords in there, being fraud, related, all those things. And so we might want to maybe either adjust the risk score if we deem that it's contributing too much to our risks and therefore skewing what our perception is of our accounts, or we might be happy with that. This is expected, whatever the case is. If it was something like non-working days that was super high, and we spoke to our clients and found out that actually they're very flexible compared to what we initially thought, we might want to completely remove that and rerun the test, if that makes sense, so that we get a better view from our risks. Okay. Now, the next sheet is the J.E.T.S parameter sheet. And over here, this is, whoops, sorry about that. There we go. Over here is the most important sheet of everything that you're seeing here. Now, it's great that we have the information and everything, but a lot of my managers, and I know a lot of managers out there, always say that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And essentially what this is the CYA, cover your, to make sure that we are documenting what we need for this test. So when we look in here, we can see that it lists each and every single test that we've selected first. It tells us the details, so either the details that we've entered in ourselves or the details that the Audit Toolbar has calculated. So you'll see for something like, let's just say over here for public holidays, if there were transactions on public holidays, it would tell us which public holidays it was that it found transactions. Okay, over here, these items for our statistical outliers are the actual parts of the calculation that have gone into the calculation of identifying the outliers. Now, it's all good and well that we have the details, but we also need to understand the methodology. Now, I've been explaining the methodology that we use for each and every single one of the tests as we've been going through it. But all of this is documented here for you so that you don't need to worry about, your regulator reviewing that file and wondering what and why these tests are happening and how they're happening. It's all documented here. Then the next thing we've got is the headings, just to show you which heading you've selected for each of the tests, right? And which heading it's going to be running based on. And lastly, we've got the risk score that we have next to each transaction. And again, over here next to the risk score, this is where we can then go ahead and add our documentation to explain exactly why we've gone with this risk level for this specific client, if that is something that if that is the approach we are choosing to make, instead of, the same risks for all our clients or just one for everything, whatever the case might be. So that essentially is the J.E.T.S function in its entirety. Now, one thing that I do want to mention about this is that most, if not all of the tests that we have selected are all available next to J.E.T.S in the Audit and Analytics drop down over here. And you'll see we've got by weekend, which helps with the weekends, after hours. This is a sequence tester, completely different, posted by keywords. You can find specific journals, when it comes to the materiality related items, you'll be able to run this sampling tool for material only, those kinds of things. So most of what you're seeing here in J.E.T.S, you'll also be able to see in the audit analytics if you only want to run that test alone. Granted, the output of the test from the audit analytics sheet might be slightly different to what the J.E.T.S analytics shows it as. Okay, so that's perfect. Thank you very much, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.